She was crowned a queen before she was even a woman. Yet her father, the very king who should have protected her, forced her into his bed to preserve a bloodline. This is the untold story of incest at the highest level of power. How a daughter's body became a battlefield for politics, how silence built dynasties, and the shocking twist that ended her reign in tragedy. And when you hear how it all ended, you won't believe it. If your father were also your king, and saying no meant death, would you risk everything to resist, or submit to survive? Leave your thoughts below, because this impossible question is at the heart of one of history's darkest royal secrets. For centuries, monarchs preached that their blood was sacred. To outsiders, incest in royal families looked like a strategy to keep power pure. But inside the palace walls, it was less about tradition and more about control. Fathers claimed daughters, uncles claimed nieces, all under the excuse that only those of royal blood were fit to rule. The truth was far darker. Women became pawns, their lives dictated by a single purpose: protect the dynasty at any cost. The real tragedy was that these queens were celebrated in public as symbols of grace. Yet privately, they were prisoners in gilded cages. Their marriages weren't about love or even politics in the usual sense. They were acts of survival, forced upon them by the very men meant to protect them. When your father is also your king, disobedience isn't an option. Refusing a royal command, whether it was a marriage, a ritual, or a private demand, was not seen as an act of independence. It was treason, and treason was punishable by death. This imbalance of power stripped daughters of choice entirely. For these women, there was no safe escape. The same man who held their fate in his hands was the same man society called their protector. Any whisper of refusal could lead to exile, imprisonment, or even execution. Behind the crown's glitter lay a darker reality. The throne wasn't just a seat of power, it was a cage with no key. Some girls weren't even teenagers when they were crowned queens. Their childhoods were stolen long before they could understand what duty truly meant. At ages as young as 12, they were married off, sometimes even to their own fathers or uncles, under the guise of dynastic security. Childhood toys were replaced with crowns, and lessons in reading or music gave way to lessons in obedience. These young queens became living sacrifices to royal ambition. Their bodies were turned into vessels for heirs, their voices silenced by a system that valued lineage over life. Court records describe them as obedient and blessed, but the reality was exploitation hidden behind ceremonial grandeur. When power and sin met in royal chambers, religion often looked the other way. In some dynasties, priests and bishops justified incestuous unions by claiming it preserved divine order. They reinterpreted scripture, blessed marriages between close kin, and in some cases even crowned the resulting offspring as divinely chosen. This religious silence wasn't born of ignorance, it was born of dependence. The church needed the crown, and the crown needed the church. To denounce royal incest would have been to weaken its own influence. So sermons praised the purity of bloodlines, while whispers in villages told a different story of deformities, illnesses, and queens trapped in suffocating unions. Historians sometimes write of these queens as willing brides, but the notion of willingness is laughable when refusal meant exile, disgrace, or death. Consent, in these palaces, was a performance. A carefully staged nod at ceremonies, a forced smile during feasts, words rehearsed and repeated under watchful eyes. Behind closed doors, the truth was different. Queens were trained to comply, told from childhood that obedience was holiness and resistance was sin. If a young queen ever dared to hesitate, courtiers reminded her of her duty to God, country, and bloodline. It wasn't consent, it was coercion wrapped in ritual. For a queen, her body was rarely her own. Every pregnancy was a national event, every miscarriage whispered about as a political disaster. In the context of incest, her body became more than a vessel for heirs. It became a tool to lock power inside a single bloodline. Daughters of kings weren't seen as people first. They were assets, living fortresses that guarded dynastic purity. The pressure was crushing. Bear sons, or risk being replaced, shamed, or discarded. For those forced into their father's bed, the stakes were even higher, because their children were both heirs and living evidence of the crime no one dared name. Dynasties obsessed with pure blood often paid a terrible price. Generations of incest produced fragile heirs, children born sickly, deformed, or mentally unstable. Medical historians point to hemophilia, epilepsy, and countless unnamed disorders that plagued royal houses for centuries. What rulers saw as strength was, in truth, a slow decay from within. Courts never admitted this openly. Official records described heirs as delicate or blessed with sensitive health. Behind the palace doors, however, entire families lived in fear of losing the very heirs they sacrificed so much to create. Ironically, the more kings clung to incest to secure their thrones, the weaker their bloodlines became. Incest in royal households was rarely truly hidden. Servants whispered, courtiers exchanged knowing glances, and foreign envoys sent coded letters describing unnatural unions. Yet still, no one intervened. The price of silence was high, but the cost of speaking up was fatal. For many, pretending not to know was an act of survival. A maid who spoke of what she saw risked the gallows. A bishop who condemned the king lost his position, or his head. So the entire system became complicit, sustained by a web of silence and fear. There were moments, rare but unforgettable, when queens tried to break free. Some fled the palace under cover of night, begging foreign courts for protection. Others appealed to priests or nobles, hoping someone would see their suffering as more than rumor. But resistance came with a terrible price. Those who ran were branded traitors. Those who spoke were silenced. In one chilling account, a young queen who refused her father's command was locked away in a convent for life, her crown stripped, her name erased. History called it piety. In truth, it was punishment disguised as holiness. If the queens suffered in silence, their children bore the scars in plain sight. Some were born healthy and ruled as kings or queens in their own right. Others carried the visible marks of generations of inbreeding, weak bodies, fragile minds, short lives. Courtiers whispered behind tapestries, careful never to let the rumors reach the throne. These children grew up haunted by questions they could never voice. Was their father also their grandfather? Was their mother truly their mother, or both sister and wife? Such questions were buried under titles and ceremonies, but the truth lingered in their blood. Entire empires rested on a fragile pact. Never speak of what happens behind palace doors. Advisors, priests, and nobles understood that exposing incest would not just shame a king. It could unravel the legitimacy of an entire dynasty. Every treaty signed, every crown passed down, every heir baptized rested on the illusion that royal blood was sacred. So silence became law. History books omitted, courts denied, and chroniclers looked the other way. A queen's suffering was buried beneath layers of ceremony, while the truth rotted the dynasty from within. It was a secret so large that to speak it aloud would be to collapse kingdoms. Among the most shocking cases is one where a queen bore children who were both her sons and her brothers. She was married to her father, then later her own sibling, trapped in a cycle of forced unions designed to keep the bloodline unbroken. Courtiers called it divine order, but the human cost was unbearable. The queen herself became a symbol of everything wrong with dynastic obsession, used, discarded, and remembered only for the heirs she produced. Her story, whispered in chronicles, became a cautionary tale. When power ignores humanity, even family turns into chains. If you've stayed with me this far, you can see how dark these royal secrets run. And this is only the halfway point. Hit subscribe and join us, because the most disturbing part of this queen's story is still to come, and it will change how you see history forever. In rare moments of desperation, some queens found a hidden voice through letters. Secretly smuggled to trusted allies or sympathetic nuns, these writings revealed truths the court never wanted preserved. Lines dripped with sorrow, fear, and resignation. One queen described her body as a prison of royal blood. Another pleaded that God might deliver her from the sins forced upon her. Most of these letters never survived. Their discovery meant destruction for both the queen and her words. But the few that remain paint a vivid picture. A woman trapped between crown and chains, begging for a freedom she knew would never come. Court doctors often stood closest to the truth, yet even they spoke in riddles. When treating queens broken by abuse, they used polite euphemisms, melancholy, frailty, delicate constitution. Their records danced around the reality, careful never to name the true cause of suffering. Yet, between the lines, a darker story emerges. Physicians described unexplained bruises, trembling nerves, or miscarriages that came too often. Some whispered that the queen's despair wasn't an illness, but the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. But, officially, the records stayed vague, protecting the dynasty, not the patient. Royal incest wasn't confined to palace walls. It spilled onto battlefields. When kings forced daughters into their beds or married sisters to secure bloodlines, rival houses cried foul. Suddenly, legitimacy of heirs was questioned, alliances collapsed, and kingdoms split into factions. One whispered rumor of tainted blood could ignite war as quickly as a broken treaty. Historians trace feuds, invasions, and even full-blown civil wars back to incestuous unions. An heir born of father and daughter was a prize for one faction, a curse for another. Bloodlines meant power, but they also meant endless conflict over who was truly pure enough to wear the crown. Perhaps the most devastating cost of incest fell on the children themselves. Infants were stillborn at alarming rates, and those who survived often carried fragile bodies and troubled minds. Court records reveal endless lines of tiny coffins, parades of mourning barely noted in official chronicles. Each loss was explained away as God's will, never as the consequence of corrupted bloodlines. For queens, every pregnancy was a trial of life and death. Each miscarriage or sickly child tightened the noose around their necks, fueling whispers that they had failed their duty. In truth, they were victims of a system that demanded heirs at any cost, then punished them when nature rebelled. Not every queen remained silent. In one extraordinary case, a royal woman dared to speak publicly of her abuse. Her words, shocking for the time, accused her father king of sins too great for heaven to ignore. Courtiers rushed to bury her testimony, calling her hysterical, possessed, or mad. But fragments of her confession survived, copied in secret by chroniclers who recognized the gravity of her courage. For the first time, the private crimes of a king entered public discourse. Whispers turned into questions, and questions into doubt. Though she was ultimately silenced, stripped of power and confined, her defiance planted a seed of suspicion that haunted the dynasty for generations. The paradox of these rulers was staggering. To the public, they were saints, defenders of faith, patrons of charity. Statues showed them as noble fathers of nations, while poets compared them to God himself. But behind gilded doors, their private lives told another story, one of coercion, incest, and cruelty masked by ceremony. The hypocrisy was deliberate. Kings staged grand festivals, funded churches, and lavished gifts upon their subjects, all while hiding unspeakable crimes within their households. The public saw a hero, the queen saw a monster. Kings who bound themselves to their daughters often grew consumed by paranoia. Having crossed the most forbidden line, they feared betrayal at every turn. Guards were doubled, spies multiplied, and the queen herself was watched more closely than ever, treated less as a partner and more as property on the verge of escape. The irony was cruel. The very act meant to secure the dynasty bred endless insecurity. These rulers trusted no one, not even the children born of their crimes. Historians note that some fathers executed sons for imagined treachery, unable to shake the suspicion that their heirs might expose them. While whispers filled the palace, ordinary subjects worshipped their rulers with blind devotion. Festivals honored the king, songs praised his glory, and peasants believed he was chosen by God. Few dared imagine that the same man blessing their harvests might be violating his own daughter. This blind faith was carefully cultivated. Public ceremonies showed the royal family as paragons of morality. The queen was displayed beside her father as a symbol of unity, never as a victim of coercion. And so, the people clapped and cheered, never realizing they were applauding a lie. In the end, the queen's fate was sealed, not by an enemy army, nor by scheming nobles, but by the very blood that bound her. Her father king, desperate to silence all whispers, sacrificed her future to protect his name. Some chronicles claim she was sent to a convent, others that she died young under mysterious circumstances. What is certain is this: she never escaped the prison of her lineage. The greatest betrayal wasn't her confinement, but the erasure of her story. Official histories painted her as obedient, even pious, while the truth of her suffering was scrubbed away. In protecting the dynasty, they destroyed the queen. Centuries later, the echoes of these incestuous unions still haunt history. Genetic diseases passed down royal lines, dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own obsession with purity, and whispers of abuse that modern historians are only now beginning to unravel. Even today, when we speak of blue blood, we are invoking a legacy shaped as much by cruelty as by crowns. The story of the queen forced by her own father is not just a medieval horror. It is a reminder of how power can twist family into chains, and how silence can preserve crimes for generations. Her tragedy may have been buried, but its lessons endure. History often remembers crowns and battles, but rarely the human cost hidden beneath them. This queen's story isn't simply about incest. It is about power so absolute it devoured the very bonds meant to protect. And in our next video, we'll uncover an even darker secret: the king who turned his entire palace into a theater of sin.